The pine forests surrounding the eastern edge of the Ardennes had always carried a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, even when nothing moved, as if the trees themselves preserved the memories of men who once crawled through their needles with rifles pressed to their chests and frost biting through their uniforms. In the winter of 1944, when the fog hung low and the distant crack of artillery echoed like a heartbeat under the frozen soil, an American sniper named William Carver stepped into that silence and vanished as if swallowed by the forest floor. His unit reported him missing during the height of the German offensive. No body was recovered, no tracks were found, and no shots were heard in the hours before he disappeared. For nearly 80 years, his name drifted through the records of wartime anomalies, another soldier claimed by the chaos of the Ardennes. The story might have ended there if not for what happened in the spring of 2024, when a buried rifle bearing his service number surfaced beneath the churned soil of a construction site, its metal warped, but unmistakably his, the last object he ever carried. Carver had been a quiet figure, even before the war hardened the silence inside him. Born in rural Iowa, raised among cornfields and long stretches of open land, he learned early how distance shapes perception. He spent his youth hunting small game with an almost unsettling patience, watching the landscape as if it were a breathing organism and he a careful observer, tracing every shift of shadow and sound. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army recognized in him something beyond standard marksmanship. It was the intensity in his eyes, the discipline in his breathing, the strange calm that settled over him while others rushed. He trained as a sniper and was assigned to a reconnaissance platoon attached to the 99th Infantry Division, a unit that would soon be thrown into the most unpredictable and deadly terrain of the European theater. His fellow soldiers later described him as someone who listened more than he spoke, someone who carried a weight they couldn't name, as if he walked with ghosts even before the war began. In early December 1944, the Ardennes stood on the threshold of disaster, though few American troops realized it. Snow crusted over the forest, muffling footsteps and burying the remnants of old skirmishes. The sky felt too quiet, too pale, the kind of stillness that seems to delay catastrophe rather than prevent it. Carver and his unit were positioned near a thinly defended sector, the kind that intelligence reports insisted was unlikely to be attacked. He spent much of his time perched in a concealed nest, overlooking a valley, documenting movement that seldom amounted to more than stray animals or distant silhouettes that dissolved into mist. Yet Carver told his squad leader that something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, only that the quiet seemed staged, as if the forest was rehearsing for an intrusion. As the tension pressed deeper into the winter air, Carver's behavior shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. He became more alert, waking in the middle of the night to listen for sounds no one else heard. He cleaned his rifle with a precision bordering on obsession, as though preparing for a moment he couldn't define, but believed was approaching. One evening, while the others played cards under dim lantern light, he sat outside the tent watching the frozen tree line. When asked what he was looking for, he answered softly that sometimes the forest tells you when someone is coming, but only if you learn how to listen. Some of the men laughed uneasily, others brushed it off as fatigue, but one soldier later said that Carver's voice carried a certainty that chilled him more than the wind. On the night before he disappeared, Carver joined a small patrol tasked with checking the perimeter. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving only the faint glow of snow to guide them. They moved in near silence, their breath rising in thin vapor their boots crunching softly with each step. The forest seemed alive with tension. Branches creaked under the weight of ice, and somewhere in the distance an owl broke the stillness with a cry that echoed unnaturally long. Carver stopped at one point, raising a hand for the others to halt. He crouched, listening, his head tilted slightly, as if deciphering a language built from wind and frost. After a long moment, he said he thought he heard someone moving parallel to them, matching their speed. The others listened, but heard nothing. When they asked if he was sure, he only nodded, eyes fixed on the dark between the trees. Before I continue, and without breaking the atmosphere of this cold and distant forest, from where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Share it below, so we know who still walks with us through these shadows. The patrol completed its sweep without incident, though the unease followed them back to camp like an unseen tail. Carver didn't sleep that night. A fellow soldier later recalled that he sat upright on his cot, rifle across his lap, staring at the canvas wall as though expecting it to open and reveal something waiting for him on the other side. At dawn, he volunteered for a solo observation shift, something he rarely did, insisting that he wanted to check a vantage point deeper in the woods. His squad leader hesitated but approved it. Carver had been reliable, cautious, and never reckless. He strapped his equipment, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and disappeared into the trees with the same quiet he had carried since the day he arrived in Europe. Hours passed without a word from him. Radio calls went unanswered. A search team found his observation post empty, the snow disturbed only by a single set of footprints that led north, before fading under a fresh layer of snowfall. No signs of struggle, no shell casings, no blood. It was as if he had walked willingly into the deeper forest and let the storm erase his tracks. His disappearance was logged hastily amid the chaos that erupted days later when the German offensive crashed through the Ardennes, reshaping the front line with brutal force. In the blinding winter of the Battle of the Bulge, Carver's fate became a footnote, overlooked in the tidal wave of casualties and confusion. For decades, his name remained on the list of unresolved disappearances. Families of missing soldiers often clung to scraps of hope, but Carver had no such closure. The forest kept its secret, locked beneath soil that froze and thawed through the passing years. That silence endured until April 2024, when construction crews preparing ground for a new warehouse near the Ardennes stumbled upon a metallic shape buried under 3 feet of compacted earth. At first, they assumed it was scrap left from old wartime debris, the kind that occasionally surfaced in the region. But when the object was unearthed, brushed clean and examined under the gray morning light, the truth became unmistakable. It was a Winchester M1 Garand sniper variant, heavily corroded but intact enough for the serial number to be read. That number traced back to one man, Staff Sergeant William J. Carver. The discovery ignited a wave of speculation, stirring up ghost stories, military theories, and whispers of long-lost wartime secrets. Why had his rifle been buried? Who buried it? And why had no other trace of him been found nearby? The rifle showed no signs of battle damage. There were no bullet impacts, no fractures consistent with a firefight. It had been placed deliberately beneath the soil, covered by layers that suggested intentional concealment rather than accidental burial. The positioning raised questions that historians and forensic experts struggled to answer. Some speculated that Carver might have abandoned his weapon in a moment of desertion, though those who knew him dismissed the idea. Others suggested he was captured, his captors burying his weapon to hide evidence. More unsettling theories proposed that whatever happened to him was not part of normal wartime operations at all. And now, before this first descent into the forest closes, if this dark narrative has held you in its grasp, consider joining this journey by subscribing. Shadows only deepen from here, and what comes next reaches even further into the silence Carver left behind. The rifle's discovery brought a flood of attention to a part of the Ardennes that had long been forgotten by time. A patch of woodland where moss now swallowed the remnants of trenches and where the roots of old pines coiled through what once had been foxholes. The construction site, intended for a new logistics facility, was halted indefinitely as forensic teams arrived, followed by historians, journalists, and eventually descendants of the soldiers who had fought and died there. The rifle itself was taken to a Belgian military archive in Bastogne, where preservation experts began the delicate process of stabilizing the metal and removing layers of corrosion. Underneath the grime, faint engravings and markings became visible. Not only the standard military serial, but small etchings along the wooden stock, personal marks that no one in official documentation could explain. Tiny crosses, carved so finely they might have been made with the tip of a knife. Some counted 12, others 13, depending on how the light hit the surface. No one could confirm when those markings had been made. Before the disappearance, or perhaps by another hand, after Carver vanished. The speculation was endless. A historian from the U.S. Army Heritage Center noted that snipers sometimes carved subtle notches to record kills, though the style and positioning here seemed different, more ritualistic, less practical. When forensic imaging revealed traces of organic residue embedded in the stock, the analysis returned something unsettling. Minute fragments of pine resin and what appeared to be microscopic threads of uniform wool, suggesting the weapon might have been wrapped or bound before burial. It wasn't thrown away. It was laid to rest. By the time word reached the United States, Carver's story had already begun to mutate into something between legend and unresolved haunting. A small online community of amateur historians and paranormal enthusiasts emerged, drawn to the eerie circumstances. They pored over wartime maps, aerial photos, and declassified reports, noting that the location where the rifle was found did not align with any recorded combat zones of Carver's unit. In 1944, that section of forest was supposed to have been behind the American line, untouched by direct engagement until days after his disappearance. The conclusion was simple but disturbing. If the rifle had been buried there, Carver had walked or been brought several kilometers into the wilderness away from his assigned position, and no other remains, American or German, were discovered near the site. As investigators retraced the geography of that time, they uncovered a series of curious wartime field notes written by a German officer captured near the same region in late 1944. The notes, faded and fragmented, mentioned an American ghost sniper operating alone in the woods, striking at night, never seen by the patrols who found their comrades dead with a single shot to the head. The officer described hearing rumors from his men that this figure moved through the snow without leaving tracks, and whispered warnings in English from the trees before firing. Of course, such tales were common in war. Fear turns soldiers into believers in the supernatural. But in this case, the stories clustered around a time frame that overlapped precisely with the last confirmed sightings of Carver. It was as if, after he vanished, something else wearing his face continued to hunt through that forest. Investigators dismissed the notion as coincidence. War breeds myth, Yet the unease surrounding the rifle refused to fade. The Belgian authorities agreed to reopen a limited excavation around the find site, hoping to uncover additional artifacts or possibly human remains. Over 2 weeks, in May 2024, ground-penetrating radar scans revealed several irregular anomalies beneath the soil. Shallow depressions, about a meter wide, clustered near the roots of an old pine. Excavation teams worked carefully, brushing aside layers of soil that smelled faintly of damp metal and age. They found no bones, but they did uncover fragments of torn canvas and rusted metallic buttons consistent with 1940s military issue. Then, deeper still, a discovery that silenced the team. A small, hand-carved wooden charm, shaped roughly like an eye. The charm was wrapped in decayed linen and tied with a thread of what looked like old hair. Forensic experts struggled to identify it. Some thought it was a personal trinket, perhaps made by a soldier as a kind of talisman, a fragment of belief meant to protect against the unrelenting uncertainty of war. Others saw it as something darker. The eye had been carved with precision, its pupil hollowed out and filled with compacted soil, suggesting ritual intent. When photographs of the object surfaced online, theories multiplied. One particularly obsessive thread linked it to old Ardennes folklore, tales of the Silent Watchers, spirits said to inhabit the forests, feeding on those who trespass alone in winter. Local legends told of soldiers from earlier wars, Napoleonic and even medieval, vanishing in the same woods, their weapons later surfacing in improbable places. Some villagers near the region whispered that the forest doesn't take men, it trades them. When the rifle was displayed briefly in a secure case at Bastogne, strange incidents were reported by the staff. Security cameras caught flickering lights at night, soft interference in the audio feeds, faint static, like whispered breath. A preservation technician working after hours claimed she heard the sound of metal being loaded, a rifle bolt sliding into place, though she was alone in the sealed lab. The story circulated quickly, half believed, half dismissed, yet no one could explain why temperature sensors near the display case dropped several degrees lower than the surrounding room whenever the rifle was present. The curators, perhaps wisely, decided to move it to controlled storage, pending further study. Meanwhile, an American documentarian named Charles Heller arrived in Belgium to produce a feature on Carver's case. Heller specialized in unsolved wartime mysteries, missing pilots, lost battalions, the kinds of stories that live between history and ghost lore. But Carver's disappearance struck a personal chord with him. His own grandfather had fought in the Ardennes and had mentioned before his death hearing about a sniper who went into the snow and never came back. Heller interviewed veterans' descendants, combed through declassified intelligence files, and eventually traced one overlooked piece of evidence. A field dispatch dated December 19, 1944, referencing a single sniper still operating east of the line, identity unknown. The location listed was within 2 kilometers of where Carver's rifle was found. That dispatch became the cornerstone of Heller's investigation. He theorized that Carver had been separated from his unit during the initial stages of the German assault, forced to operate alone and perhaps psychologically fractured by isolation and exhaustion. But there was an inconsistency. The dispatch described the lone sniper as wearing partial German winter gear, suggesting he had scavenged it from fallen enemies. It also stated that his shots were unusually precise and seemed to come from multiple angles, implying either multiple shooters or someone moving impossibly fast between firing positions. None of it fit cleanly into the logic of battle. When Heller shared his findings with a local historian, the man only shook his head and said, "The forest keeps its dead awake." By late summer 2024, Heller had gathered enough material to release a short documentary online titled The Vanishing of Staff Sergeant Carver. Within weeks it went viral, not just among history buffs, but within darker corners of the internet. Forums dedicated to disappearances, occult theories, and military hauntings. Some viewers claimed to have seen something in the footage. A faint figure moving between trees in one of Heller's drone shots near the excavation site. Others reported hearing whispers in the background audio at the exact timestamp when the camera panned over the buried rifle. Heller dismissed it as pareidolia, the human tendency to find meaning in noise. Still, the more he denied it, the more attention it drew. Not long after, Heller received an anonymous email containing 3 black and white photographs. Each showed the same section of forest, taken at different angles. In the third, partially obscured by shadow, was what appeared to be a human silhouette standing beside a tree. The metadata dated the images to December 1944. Experts later verified the film stock and equipment as consistent with wartime cameras. No record existed of who took them or why. But one detail was undeniable: the silhouette's stance, the way it held its rifle across the chest. It matched precisely with the known training posture of U.S. Army snipers from that era. Somewhere in the vast archive of wartime mystery, Carver's name had been whispered back into existence. The deeper Heller searched, the stranger the trail became. Local archives held no record of any recovered American body in that area, but a farmer's diary from 1952 mentioned finding a hollow in the woods where the snow never settled, where birds avoided landing. He wrote that he felt as if someone was still watching from the trees. The entry ended with a single line, underlined twice. "The forest breathes." And now, if you've followed the shadows this far and the silence hasn't driven you away, you might want to linger with us a little longer. Subscribe to keep tracing these echoes of the past, because the deeper we go, the colder it gets, and the things waiting in the next layer of this story are not done watching us yet. By the time autumn of 2024 settled across the Ardennes, the forest had become a living archive of unanswered questions. The site where Carver's rifle had been unearthed was cordoned off, and yet visitors kept arriving. History students, local guides, even those drawn purely by the dark fascination of a place that seemed to hum with residual energy. Among them were men and women who swore that something about the trees felt different, that the air grew thicker the deeper one walked in. The Belgian authorities allowed limited academic access, but one by one, research teams reported malfunctioning equipment, corrupted audio files, cameras that refused to focus in specific directions. It was all anecdotal, of course, easily dismissed by skeptics. Yet even the most rational investigators began speaking more softly when discussing Carver's name near the site, as though the very sound of it disturbed the stillness that clung to the forest floor. Charles Heller returned in October to film follow-up footage for a longer documentary. He came armed with better equipment, infrared sensors, and a small crew determined to capture definitive material. The forest greeted them with a silence so absolute it felt deliberate. Heller described it later in his production notes. The sense that the trees absorbed sound, swallowing it whole, leaving only the brittle echo of their own breathing. The team spent 3 nights camping near the excavation perimeter, and each night they reported subtle disturbances, a whisper of movement beyond the circle of light, a low mechanical click, like a rifle bolt sliding back. One of the crew members, a sound technician named Ardennes, claimed that during the second night she awoke to see a faint figure standing among the trees, its outline blurred by mist. She reached for her flashlight, and the moment she turned it on, the figure was gone. In the morning they found shallow impressions in the frost, not quite footprints, but something like the memory of them. Heller's camera logs captured the most chilling evidence. At precisely 3:17 a.m. on the third night, the motion sensors recorded a brief disturbance about 20 meters beyond their camp. The footage showed nothing at first but dense fog. Then, in a single frame, something metallic glinted near the ground, as though light had caught the edge of a scope. The following frame went completely black, and all audio cut out for 7 seconds. The crew didn't notice until they reviewed the footage days later. Experts would later confirm no external interference, no electromagnetic source, no hardware fault. The data simply ceased to exist for that brief moment. Heller uploaded that clip to his production archive under the name Sequence 19, The Silence Gap. As Heller's project deepened, he discovered something more disturbing than any spectral rumor. In military archives digitized only recently, he located correspondence between officers from Carver's division. One message, dated December 22, 1944, mentioned disciplinary concerns regarding SS Carver, possible psychological compromise following prolonged isolation. Another, sent a day later, ordered a search for one unaccounted sniper, presumed missing in action but potentially active beyond assigned grid. It suggested that Carver might not have simply vanished. He might have defected into the woods, operating independently long after the front had shifted. This revelation reframed everything. If Carver survived for even a few days after disappearing, where had he gone? What had he been doing? And why had his rifle been buried so far from any trace of him? The deeper Heller dug, the more fragmented the records became. One decrypted German field report, dated early January 1945, made mention of an American shooter with uncanny aim, striking patrols at distances that defied known ballistics for the M1 rifle. The report speculated that the shooter may use optical deception or mirrors, but perhaps most hauntingly, it ended with a note written by hand. When we reached the position of his fire, we found only frozen branches arranged like a cross. To Heller, this wasn't just evidence of a rogue sniper. It was ritual, deliberate, symbolic, and somehow connected to the carved marks found on Carver's recovered rifle. He shared his findings in an interview broadcast from a small studio in Liège. The video went viral overnight, circulating through online spaces obsessed with the supernatural and with wartime lore. Viewers dissected every frame, convinced they could see shapes moving in the background of Heller's forest footage. Some pointed to faint figures near the tree line, others to brief flashes of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with breathing. A handful of skeptics argued it was all pareidolia and optical interference, but one chilling pattern emerged. Every viewer who claimed to have slowed the footage down and studied it, frame by frame, reported the same thing. A moment, less than half a second long, when the forest appeared to shift. Trees seemed to lean subtly inward, as if listening. The phenomenon soon took on a life of its own, becoming known online as the Carver Shift. Dozens of people uploaded their own slowed-down versions of the footage, each claiming to have isolated something new. A face in the mist, a shadow moving against the wind, a whisper buried in the static. A few particularly dedicated users combined the frequencies of those whispers and discovered that when amplified, They formed something almost like words. The consensus translation, though uncertain, was chillingly simple. He never left. Meanwhile, back in the Ardennes, something tangible began to happen. Locals reported hearing distant gunfire echoing through the woods on windless nights. Always 3 shots, spaced evenly, fading into silence. Hunters found animal carcasses near the ridgeline. Clean bullet wounds, no tracks around them. Belgian authorities dismissed it as coincidence, possibly illegal hunting. But those who lived closest to the forest swore that the shots always came at the same hour, just before dawn, the same time Carver had last been seen alive. Heller returned to the States in late November to compile his final footage. Yet within weeks of arriving home, strange events began to follow him. His editing software corrupted every file labeled Sequence 19. His audio drives emitted faint static when idle, as if playing back something inaudible to the human ear. He woke one night to find his computer monitor glowing faintly, displaying a single line of text across the screen. "You see me." Investigators later concluded it was likely a glitch, a stuck command in the playback buffer, but Heller swore he had unplugged the computer entirely before going to bed. In an attempt to rationalize the growing fear, he reached out to Dr. Elise Durant, a cognitive historian specializing in wartime trauma. Durant believed that the combination of isolation, folklore, and suggestive imagery could create self-perpetuating hallucinations. "We imprint ghosts onto history," she said during an interview. "We fill the gaps with what frightens us most, ourselves." But when she reviewed Heller's recordings, even she admitted to feeling a distinct unease she couldn't explain. "There's something about the silence," she said, "the way it feels inhabited." Heller decided to return to Belgium one last time, planning to spend a single night alone at the excavation site, recording continuous footage. He announced the idea online, calling it Project Watchpoint. Followers flooded the comment sections with warnings, prayers, and invitations to live stream the event. He ignored most of them. On December 13th, he flew back to Europe, carrying a small kit, thermal camera, shortwave receiver, and the same Winchester casing recovered from Carver's rifle, which the museum had allowed him to borrow for symbolic reasons. He entered the forest before sunset and set up camp near the original dig site. The last footage recovered from his camera showed him speaking softly to the lens, breath visible in the freezing air. "It's quieter than before," he said, "like the forest's been waiting." Behind him, the trees stood in perfect stillness. Then, just as he turned off the lamp and the darkness folded in, a faint mechanical sound emerged from somewhere off-screen. A metallic click, followed by a whisper that might have been the wind or something else entirely. The recording ended abruptly at 2:46 a.m. Heller was reported missing the next morning when he failed to check out of his hotel. Belgian police mounted an extensive search but found only his tent, partially collapsed, his gear still intact, his camera half buried in frost. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, and no tracks leading in or out. Just an empty space in the snow, as if something had lifted him cleanly away. Days later, the thermal camera's memory card was recovered and analyzed. For the last 2 minutes of footage, the screen displayed only heat signatures. Faint orange glows of the campfire, a few trees, and then suddenly a shape emerging from the cold. It stood upright, human-sized, but emitted no heat at all. It moved slowly toward the camera, stopped, and turned its head slightly. The outline was unmistakable, a man holding a rifle. And now, if this story has pulled you this far into the cold silence of the Ardennes, you should remain with us. Subscribe, stay close, because the forest isn't finished speaking, and what follows next will take us even deeper into the dark, where history and haunting become the same. When the Belgian authorities officially closed the investigation into Charles Heller's disappearance, they filed it under environmental misadventure. The phrase, clean and bureaucratic, suggested an accident, disorientation, hypothermia, or a fall into one of the deep sinkholes that dotted the old forest. But the case file told another story. No thermal trace of a human body was ever found in subsequent aerial sweeps. No scent picked up by tracking dogs. Even the snow around his abandoned camp seemed unnatural, smooth and undisturbed, as if freshly fallen, though meteorological records confirmed there had been no snowfall that night. The investigation left the same hollow ache that had surrounded Carver's case 80 years before. Two men, swallowed by the same forest, 8 decades apart, one rifle bridging the distance between them. In the weeks that followed, a quiet panic rippled through the small Belgian towns surrounding the excavation zone. Workers on the halted construction project began to resign in groups. They spoke in low voices of strange noises after dusk. Faint metallic clatters, muffled footsteps pacing the perimeter fence. Security guards refused to take the night shift after 2 separate incidents where floodlights malfunctioned simultaneously across the site, plunging it into complete darkness for several minutes. When power returned, one guard reported seeing a man standing between the pylons, though when he approached, there was no one there. Surveillance footage from that night showed nothing, only static interference and a frame that blurred, as if the camera itself had flinched. Local media picked up the story, branding the site the cursed dig of Bastogne. Tourists arrived briefly, hoping for a glimpse of the so-called ghost sniper, but left quickly after nightfall. The forest seemed to repel human presence, returning to its silence each evening, as if indifferent to the curiosity it inspired. The Belgian government eventually restricted all access, citing environmental reasons. Yet one journalist managed to capture a photograph from beyond the barrier, a grainy image showing faint depressions in the snow leading away from the old dig site, stopping abruptly near a tree whose bark bore a carved mark, a small cross. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Heller's footage continued to spread. Despite his disappearance, someone, perhaps a team member, perhaps a third party, uploaded his final compiled work to multiple platforms under the title Watchpoint, The Carver Files. The video combined archival documents, interviews, and his last on-site recordings. It opened with a quote displayed over black. "He walked into the quiet, and the quiet walked back." The film's release reignited public obsession with the mystery, and within days, millions had watched. Viewers claimed that in certain sections, faint whispers could be heard beneath the narration. Audio analysts who attempted to isolate them found low-frequency murmurs forming patterns that resembled coordinates, latitude, and longitude points that, when plotted, marked the exact site of Carver's last reported position in 1944. Those coordinates drew attention not just from enthusiasts, but from the U.S. Army's Historical Division. Officially, they were uninterested in conspiracy. Unofficially, a small group of investigators was dispatched to Belgium in early 2025 to conduct a private assessment. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Macmillan, a specialist in recovered war remains, known for her meticulous and skeptical approach. Macmillan arrived with a simple mission: to verify the legitimacy of the coordinates and ensure that the American government's reputation wasn't entangled in sensationalism. But within days of arriving, her tone shifted. In internal communications later leaked to the press, she wrote, "The site feels wrong. Instruments behave unpredictably. I can't explain it, but it's as though the air has weight here." Macmillan's team spent 3 days scanning the terrain using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometers. What they found only deepened the unease. Beneath the roots of the same cluster of pines where the rifle had been discovered lay an irregular cavity, approximately the size of a human body. Yet the cavity was empty. No bones, no fabric, no metal. The soil samples surrounding it contained elevated traces of iron and carbon, suggesting the presence of decayed metal long ago. But what truly disturbed the analysts was the magnetic anomaly emanating from that cavity. Instruments registered faint rhythmic pulses, almost like a heartbeat, repeating every 62 seconds. When the equipment was moved away from the site, the pulse ceased. When returned, it resumed. The data was inconclusive, but the emotional response was not. Members of the team began to complain of disorientation, headaches, even auditory hallucinations, soft clicks and metallic snaps echoing in the distance. One technician quit mid-assignment after claiming she heard someone whispering her name from behind, though no one was there. Macmillan documented each incident carefully, but admitted in her private journal that she was beginning to feel watched. Her entries became increasingly fragmented, filled with sketches of trees, coordinates, and repeated phrases like, "He's still out there." The mission was abruptly terminated after the 4th night, when one of the magnetometers overheated and emitted a short burst of static that was later analyzed by audio engineers. Hidden in the distortion was a fragment of human speech, a male voice, low and distant, repeating the same 4 words, "Leave it where it lies." Officials dismissed the recording as coincidence, the result of radio interference, but Macmillan's final report ended with a sentence that was never meant to be made public. "The forest remembers him, and it does not forgive intrusion." After the U.S. team's withdrawal, the site fell silent again, but the pulse did not stop. Belgian researchers returned months later, independently measuring the same rhythmic magnetic signal, still emanating from beneath the ground. They proposed that unexploded ordnance might be responsible, or perhaps a remnant of buried communications equipment. Yet when they dug shallow test trenches, they found nothing metallic, just frozen soil and tangled roots that seemed to twist in unnatural patterns, curling toward the empty space like veins toward a heart. By mid-2025, the mystery had become a phenomenon that transcended academic interest. It had entered the realm of cultural myth. Podcasts, books, and online documentaries speculated endlessly, some arguing that Carver had discovered something in the forest, a hidden bunker or weapon cache that others wanted to keep secret, others claiming he had merged with the very landscape, a spirit bound to the geography of violence. The most disturbing theory came from a retired Belgian folklorist named Henri Dumaine, who connected the events to a pre-Christian myth of the marksman of the pines, a figure said to appear during times of war, guiding lost soldiers into the trees before turning his rifle on them. Dumaine pointed out that the earliest record of this myth dated to the 1600s, describing a man in the frost who takes the shape of those who trespass. Around the same time, rumors spread of new sightings, Travelers passing through the forest after dark reported flashes of light deep among the trunks. Not torches, not headlights, but single, sharp bursts, like distant muzzle flashes. In one case, a group of students hiking near the restricted area claimed to have heard the distinct crack of a rifle shot, followed by silence so deep it hurt their ears. When they returned to their car, they found its windshield shattered cleanly through the center, the edges lined with frost despite the warm air. No bullet was recovered. As these reports accumulated, the authorities tried to suppress them. But online, the fascination only grew. A new term emerged, Carver syndrome, a phrase used to describe the psychological effect of prolonged exposure to the mystery, a mix of obsession, paranoia, and sleeplessness induced by studying the case too closely. Users on dark forums warned newcomers to stop watching the final 2 minutes of Watchpoint at full volume, claiming the whispers became clearer the more you listened, as though the sound itself was learning your attention. Some said that once you heard the fourth click, always the fourth, you began to dream of snow and breathless silence. By late autumn, the Belgian authorities permanently sealed off the forest zone. Yet even from a distance, visitors reported strange sensations, sudden cold pockets, the smell of gun oil, and the eerie impression that someone stood just behind them, unseen. Those who dared to stay past midnight sometimes heard footsteps crunching faintly on the frost, stopping only when they turned around. The legend of William Carver had evolved from a wartime mystery into something far older and more primal, a story about the permanence of violence, about how the land itself absorbs the fear it witnesses. The forest that swallowed him now carried his name in whispers, its silence no longer neutral but watchful. And somewhere beneath those trees, where the magnetic pulse still throbbed faintly in the soil, it was said that if you pressed your ear to the ground and waited long enough, you could hear the soft metallic sound of a bolt sliding back and the breath of someone aiming. If this descent into the shadows of history has drawn you in, stay close, subscribe, keep listening, because what waits in the next layer is not just the forest's memory, but its hunger. By the winter of 2025, the Ardennes forest was no longer merely a landscape on the map. It had become a boundary, a point where history and something older, colder, and less forgiving seemed to converge. The story of Staff Sergeant William Carver had crossed beyond academic debate into the realm of folklore, yet it retained a core of undeniable reality. A rifle unearthed where no rifle should have been, a journalist who vanished while chasing the truth, and a pulse beneath the soil that refused to die. The forest stood untouched under a ceiling of heavy snow, its paths barricaded and its entrances marked by warning signs in 3 languages. But those who lived in nearby villages said the signs did nothing. The forest didn't need walls to keep people out. It had its own way of choosing who could enter and who would return. That December, a new expedition arrived, this time unofficial, unannounced, and entirely unsanctioned. A small group of independent researchers calling themselves the Echo Team slipped past the perimeter at night, determined to uncover what governments and institutions had failed to explain. The team consisted of 5 members, a British geologist, an American sound engineer, a Belgian historian, a documentarian, and a retired Army intelligence officer named Robert Vance, who claimed to have served with the grandson of one of Carver's wartime comrades. Their purpose was simple: to locate the magnetic anomaly and record continuous audio overnight. But their motives were less scientific. Vance, in particular, believed there was something more to Carver's story. Not superstition, not myth, but a secret buried deliberately, something the forest had been made to guard. They entered the woods on December 19th, precisely 81 years to the day after Carver's disappearance. The air was painfully cold, their breaths forming pale ghosts in the dark. Snow crunched underfoot in a rhythm that soon became unsettling, like walking in time with something unseen. They reached the approximate coordinates just after midnight, guided by handheld GPS units that began glitching as they neared the site. The signals wavered, then froze, displaying the same coordinates repeatedly no matter which direction they turned. "It's like the forest won't let us leave this point," the geologist murmured. They decided to set camp right where the devices locked, unaware that the spot lay only a few meters from where Heller's tent had been found. The night unfolded slowly, the kind of slow that stretches sound until silence becomes unbearable. Their instruments picked up faint bursts of static, too rhythmic to be random. The sound engineer adjusted his headset and froze. The pattern in the static matched a heartbeat. He increased the gain, and the pulse grew louder. 62 beats apart, just as recorded months earlier. But after a few minutes, something changed. The intervals shortened, 58 seconds, then 55. "It's accelerating," he whispered, but before anyone could respond, another sound bled through the static. A distant metallic click, unmistakable in tone. A rifle bolt being drawn back. The historian insisted it was interference, perhaps from a nearby electrical relay, but there were none for kilometers. The snow around them was unbroken, the air so still it felt as if the entire forest held its breath. Then came the whisper. Faint, fractured, like a recording played through broken speakers. No words, just a drawn-out sigh, almost human. The geologist raised his flashlight toward the trees and froze. Between two trunks stood a figure, half shrouded in fog. It was motionless, dark against the white snow, and yet the outline shimmered slightly, as if the air around it were colder. When the beam touched it, the figure dissolved, not vanishing instantly, but fading like smoke. Panic rippled through the group. The documentarian, filming with an infrared camera, swung the lens wildly. For a moment, the viewfinder caught something the naked eye could not. A heatless form moving between the trees, leaving behind faint streaks of cold. The camera's temperature sensors dipped suddenly, dropping 5 degrees in seconds. Then the battery died without warning. Every device followed. GPS, cameras, microphones, all drained simultaneously. Only the audio recorder continued, powered by an analog battery pack, its red light blinking steadily in the dark. They huddled around it, whispering arguments about leaving, but the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening. At precisely 02:14 a.m., the recorder captured a clear voice, male, speaking softly in English. The words were indistinct at first, buried under static, but after digital enhancement days later, experts identified a phrase repeated twice. "It's too quiet." Those were the same words Carver had written in his final field report before vanishing in 1944. Moments after that recording, the group decided to retreat. They gathered their gear and retraced their path, but their tracks had vanished, not covered, not snowed over, simply gone. The historian began shouting, her breath forming frantic bursts in the air. "We're moving in circles," Vance said, his compass spinning uselessly in his hand. Then from somewhere ahead, a light appeared, faint, golden, steady. It looked like the flame of a lantern swaying slowly in the darkness. Believing it might be their way out, they followed it, stumbling through the snow. But as they drew closer, the light receded, always just a few meters ahead, until it disappeared completely. When they stopped, the forest was utterly still again. No wind, no sound, no light. Only then did they realize one of their members was missing. The sound engineer, who had been walking in the middle of the group moments earlier, was gone. His footprints ended abruptly where he had last stood. No sign of struggle, no broken branches, just an empty patch of snow and the faint impression of a boot heel melting into frost. They called his name for hours. Nothing answered. By dawn, the survivors reached the forest's edge, exhausted and frostbitten, their equipment nearly destroyed by the cold. They handed over the audio recorder to Belgian authorities, refusing to enter the forest again. The missing man was never found. The government suppressed the story, labeling it a case of exposure and disorientation. But the audio file leaked online within weeks. Listeners who played it in darkness claimed to hear an additional voice layered beneath the static, deeper, slower, and whispering words that no one could agree upon. Some thought it said, "He's still hunting." Others swore it said, "He remembers." A few insisted the voice was speaking in German, repeating the phrase, "Bleib still, stay still." As winter deepened, reports from the Ardennes increased. Locals spoke of hearing distant rifle cracks again, always in threes. Hunters began abandoning the area altogether after finding fresh bullet holes in tree trunks near paths long closed to the public. Military officials attempted to dismiss the events, but satellite thermal scans occasionally picked up brief humanoid heat signatures inside the restricted forest. Signatures that vanished seconds after detection. Each time the sensors recorded the same pattern. A human figure kneeling low, as though aiming. The following spring, the last surviving member of Echo Team, Robert Vance, granted a single interview before retreating from public life. His face was thin, his eyes sleepless. "I don't care what they say," he murmured. "He's still in there. The forest isn't haunted. It's occupied." When asked if he believed Carver was alive, Vance shook his head. "Not alive, but not gone either. He's what happens when war refuses to end." His words spread like wildfire. The phrase, "The forest isn't haunted, it's occupied," became a grim mantra among those obsessed with the case, appearing on online forums, graffiti, even T-shirts. Yet beneath the viral fascination lay something more disturbing. Several viewers of the Lake Echo Team footage began reporting recurring dreams. They described standing in a forest under pale light, hearing the slow, mechanical click of a rifle, and feeling breath on the back of their necks, though no one stood behind them. Psychologists called it collective suggestion. Others called it an invitation. By the end of 2025, the Ardennes region had become a no-go zone, patrolled but rarely entered. The magnetic pulse still persisted, faint but measurable, repeating every 62 seconds, though once every few days it accelerated briefly, as though responding to some unseen rhythm. Theories multiplied endlessly, but no one could agree on a rational explanation. Whatever happened in 1944, whatever swallowed Carver and later Heller, seemed to exist now beyond the reach of reason. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a place, a living memory that devoured those who tried to map it. And yet, late-night hosts and storytellers across the internet continued to whisper about the forest. Some even dared to claim that on certain nights, if you play the audio of the last Echo Team recording near the tree line, you can hear a faint echo answer from within. Not an echo of your own sound, but a response. A voice saying softly, "Still here." Before we step into the final chapter, if this story has held you through its silence and frost, if the shadows of history have kept your eyes open until now, like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because what comes next is the end of the trail, and what waits there is the truth that was never meant to be found. When the frost began to lift from the Ardennes in early 2026, the forest seemed to wake from something deeper than winter. Not renewal, but remembering. Snowmelt seeped into the soil where the rifle had once been buried, softening the ground until it looked almost like it could breathe. The locals said the forest felt restless that year. At night they heard the low hum of wind that wasn't wind at all, like a whisper traveling just beneath the surface. And sometimes, if the air was still enough, they swore they could hear it. The sound of a bolt sliding back, the metallic heartbeat of something waiting. The Belgian authorities kept the area sealed, yet the perimeter fences were found cut 3 separate times. Whoever had entered left no trace. The guards reported seeing faint flashes in the distance, quick and precise, always 3 in sequence, the unmistakable rhythm of a sniper's volley. No shell casings were ever recovered. The cameras that should have recorded it showed only empty frames, as if the forest itself had swallowed the light. Then, one morning in March, a group of forestry workers discovered something that would reignite the entire mystery. Beneath a shallow patch of thawed ground near the original dig site, they found a set of remains. Not old, not from the war, but recent. DNA analysis confirmed what many feared and expected. The body belonged to Charles Heller. His camera was missing, his phone destroyed, but a small analog audio recorder lay intact beside him, its casing frosted over, its tape still wound tight. When the authorities played it, they found it contained exactly 6 minutes of sound. The recording began with Heller's voice, tired but steady. "It's colder now," he said. "I think the forest remembers me." Behind him, the wind howled softly through branches. He spoke of seeing faint lights between the trees, of hearing a voice calling his name in English, then in German. "I know what you are," he whispered, "and I know why you stayed." At the 4-minute mark, the sound shifted. The wind stopped completely. What followed was silence, the kind that seems to listen. Then came the slow metallic sound, unmistakable. A rifle bolt pulled back, followed by a long exhale, then 3 measured shots in the distance. The tape ended with a whisper so faint it took weeks of audio reconstruction to make out. The words were simple: "You shouldn't have come back." The Belgian press tried to suppress the details, but the leak spread fast. Within days, clips of the audio circulated online, and speculation erupted again. Some claiming the shots were staged, others convinced they had captured the voice of Carver himself. Analysts dissected the file, noting strange frequency distortions that shouldn't have been possible on analog tape. In the background of the first minute, a faint rhythmic thump could be heard. 62 beats apart. The pulse again. Whatever it was, it had followed Heller into death. The discovery of Heller's remains reignited interest from both American and Belgian military archives. Forensic archaeologists returned to the forest that spring, this time equipped with advanced sensors and deep soil radar. What they found beneath the site stunned them. At a depth of nearly 3 meters, embedded in compacted clay, they uncovered fragments of a wooden crate and a decayed U.S. Army insignia plate. The crate's contents had long rotted, but inside were several rusted ammunition clips and a corroded dog tag. The name was faint, but legible. Carver, W.J. Yet the dog tag was wrong. Its serial number didn't match the one recorded for William Carver in 1944. Instead, it was off by one digit, a deliberate alteration, as though someone had forged or replaced it. Experts debated whether it was an administrative error or something more intentional. Some argued that the Army had misfiled Carver's identity during the chaos of the Ardennes offensive. Others suspected the dog tag had been planted. But by whom and why, no one could answer. Beneath the crate, the excavation uncovered something else. A single unfired bullet, perfectly preserved, standing upright in the soil as though placed there deliberately. Its surface bore faint etchings, a pattern of tiny crosses identical to those carved on Carver's rifle stock. The bullet was taken to a secure lab in Brussels for examination. During spectral analysis, technicians reported brief drops in temperature, 5 degrees in under 30 seconds. One technician later claimed the bullet emitted a low vibration, almost inaudible, like distant breathing. The lab dismissed her report as stress-induced, but within a week, 2 of her colleagues resigned without explanation. The bullet, though inert, was eventually sealed in a lead-lined case and sent to storage. No further testing was authorized. By late summer, the forest had reclaimed the excavation zone entirely. Grass and roots grew over the disturbed earth, and a new generation of pines sprouted through the soil, their growth unnaturally aligned in straight military rows. Locals began calling that patch the Soldiers' Clearing. Hunters avoided it. Even birds seemed to circle it wide. Those who passed nearby said they sometimes heard distant footsteps pacing the boundary, followed by 3 slow rifle cracks echoing faintly through the mist. Then came the strangest report of all. A park ranger patrolling the area in September captured a photograph just before dawn. An image blurred by motion, yet unmistakably human. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded by fog, wearing what appeared to be a tattered military uniform with faded U.S. markings. Across his shoulder, he carried a rifle. Experts who enhanced the image noted that the serial markings on the weapon's barrel, barely visible in the blur, matched the same number as Carver's rifle, the one recovered 2 years before and locked away in Bastogne. But that weapon, according to the archives, had never left the museum's vault. When investigators checked the vault, they found the display case intact, but the rifle inside was gone. No sign of forced entry, no alarm triggered, only a thin layer of frost clinging to the glass, and a single phrase scratched faintly into the condensation from inside. Still here. The photograph circulated quietly, never confirmed, never denied. Officially, it was labeled a forgery. Unofficially, it became the final chapter of the Carver mystery. Theories multiplied endlessly. A ghost soldier bound to his weapon, a consciousness imprinted into the forest by trauma, a government experiment buried under the guise of myth. But for those who had walked the woods, the truth felt simpler and infinitely darker. Some things never end. Some wars keep fighting themselves long after the soldiers are gone. To this day, hikers who stray too deep into the Ardennes sometimes report hearing the soft mechanical rhythm of a bolt sliding back, followed by 3 distant shots echoing through the pines. No one has ever traced their origin. No muzzle flash, no sound of departure, only impact, felt deep in the chest, like memory itself, firing. And so the forest waits. Beneath its roots, the pulse continues. 62 seconds apart, steady, patient, eternal. A heartbeat for something that should not breathe anymore, but does. Somewhere between the frost and the soil, between 1944 and now, the line between man and myth has blurred completely. William Carver has become what he once hunted, a watcher in the trees, a shadow stitched into the silence of war, a marksman for whom time no longer moves. So if you ever find yourself in the Ardennes when the mist begins to rise, and the world goes still around you, do not call out. Do not listen for footsteps. The forest doesn't echo. It answers. And sometimes, when the past turns its gaze toward the living, it doesn't look away. If you've made it this far, through the quiet and the cold, then you've walked beside us through every breath of this story. Like the forest, let this memory linger. And if you want more stories that still breathe beneath history's frost, like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us, would you keep walking into the silence, or would you turn back before the rifle breathes again?